OG Rose, and today we're going to be talking about section 49 of Belonging again, and we will be asking the question, can meaning give us rest? And this question brings to mind the meaning crisis as discussed by Dr. John Vervaeke, and meaning certainly does seem necessary for a fulfilling life, and it would seem as if indeed there is a lot of trouble today because people cannot find meaning. Now, I think in the discussion as discussed in the map crisis paper of the book, Belonging Again, there's a conflation of many different problems together. You have the Daniel Schleiermacher meta crisis, you have the mental health crisis, you have the meaning crisis, and I think all of these in different, you could talk about the courage crisis, in allusion to Mr. Ebert's work, that wonderful statement that Mr. Alexander Ebert has, where he says the meaning of life is courage, and I really like that. So there's many different things that seem to be overlapping, and in no way whatsoever do I want to suggest that meaning doesn't matter. Meaning certainly matters. It is an essential human need. The issue is that I think categories like meaning and belonging are being conflated together, and I think, in fact, if we get meaning, we may not necessarily get belonging. I will also talk about purpose and meaning rather interchangeably in this section, and although in other works, you can make divisions between those terms, I have not so much here. I think we need to consider that the differences between meaning and belonging, which though remarkably similar, are not identical. It seems to be the case that all belonging entails meaning, but not all meaning entails belonging, even though the feeling of having meaning can be identified as the feeling of having belonging. Now, I don't mean to say that it's impossible for a person to have belonging and not meaning, but it does seem to be the case that one can be entailed without the other. And I think what's important to realize is that belonging is far more sociological. It's far more of a social claim, or at least historically it has been, while meaning is much more individual. Now, of course, belonging could lead to the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt is talking about, the state of the mass. So I'm not trying to say belonging is good and meaning is not. And meaning can lead to, the mob, right? Because utopianism has meaning to people, but it leads to a lot of trouble. Basically, it seems we need to have both. But I think it is important to realize that just because we get meaning, let's say we do meaning-making practices, let's say we figure out we want to be a writer, it doesn't follow that that's necessarily going to give us belonging, nor is it going to address our communal issues, or where we feel like we don't have a community today. And I think it's easy, though, in our head to get those conflated, the categories of meaning and belonging, and basically this section wants to make the argument that we need to keep those apart. Writing, for example, can be a deeply meaningful activity, but writing can also contribute to a person feeling like he or she doesn't belong, for no one around that individual understands the person's work, thinks writing is a good use of time, or writes themselves. As a result, the writer can feel alone and like he or she doesn't belong. Now, you can, in the act of writing, become self-forgetful and not really worry about, or, it becomes practically irrelevant to you that you don't belong. But the point is that meaning-making practices can actually lead to you having less belonging, not necessarily more. Now, I do think where there's a loss of belonging, there's also a loss of meaning, because as soon as you finish your writing, without that feeling of it being situated in a community or something bigger than yourself, or a capital X, it can start to feel like it's arbitrary. The writing is just a distraction from things that really matter, and that can lead to all sorts of uncertainties and pathologies. And I think why this is important to realize that these categories are separate is because, again, we can do these things to regain meaning, assuming we'll get belonging when we don't. Now, the section is going to talk about how in the past, I think the categories of belonging and meaning were more together because of the technological condition. And so, if we look at history and it's like, oh, people who had belonging also had meaning, it's easy to think that if we gain meaning today, we'll also get belonging. But there's been a historical change. I can be on the internet right now and very interested in learning about Hegel, while my neighbor can be a blacksmith or working on the pipes, and the neighbor after them can be some sort of financial, some sort of expert in finance that's always traveling. So we're very separate lives. Every individual could find meaning, but we don't actually have a community into which we can fit and belong. Now, I can, in my meaning act, find belonging or feel like I'm fitted to what I'm supposed to be doing. But using belonging in this way is going to be very different than how it's been used in the past, sociologically. And this would mean that the belonging crisis, as we could call it, is not the same as the meaning crisis, and that we have to consider them differently and address them both. And I think if you don't address them both, then if you address one, you're not necessarily going to address the other. Also, by the term meaning, I think once you kind of get this dialectic, you're going to see why meaning has to get into stuff like facing fears, developing courage, facing the cons, the real. That meaning, it's not going to do, it's going to be unveiled that we can't by meaning simply be talking about something that feels nice on the weekend, or something like writing or art that makes us feel good. It feels like what we're supposed to be doing. Because you don't necessarily have to develop courage to do that. But if you start talking about finding a community or creating a community or dealing with other people, then say if you do art, you have to face people who may think that that's a waste of time or is a silly use of time. So to take seriously belonging as distinct from meaning is going to very likely put you in social environments where you encounter neurosis and different troubles that are hard to overcome. So indeed, today we're just simply not as bound by our material condition as we were in the past. It's easier to transcend your material condition. And where people shared similar material conditions, say everyone was a farmer, well, it was easier to feel like you belong because you're with people who farm and they understand you and you have a shared intelligibility because you all farm together, so it feels like you're in the right place because you quote-unquote are a farmer. Whereas today, there's much more possibility, there's much more options for who people are, and so you can't be so sure that the people around you have a shared intelligibility. Well, this is kind of funny because that would mean precisely the increase of options for ways of life, which means an increase of options for ways to find meaning, works against belonging. So actually meaning and what gains meaning can reduce belonging, and what gains belonging can reduce meaning. So that they're not identical. In fact, they can be exact opposites and can in fact work in conflict with one another. Ultimately, what this is going to mean is that if we're going to deal with the belonging crisis, the meaning crisis, the courage crisis, it would definitely seem as if we need three things: meaning, belonging, and the capital X variable we've been talking about throughout belonging. And the capital X variable is created by a Nietzschean child in absolute nowhere, into which they can find fittedness. And this X is transcendent of them. It has authority over them. It's a law that is hung around the child's neck, to use Nietzsche's language, that they belong in. They belong under the authority of that capital X. And so you can have belonging, meaning, and also to be the Nietzschean child, you're going to have to do incredible work on the subject, develop courage, take risk. Taking risk is a huge dimension of this, and that's also going to be generating intrinsic motivation, because I think there's a motivation crisis in all this. Now, we ultimately have to ask, though, can we spread the capital X variable? Can we spread the conditions of people being children and do so in a manner that they are able to still share intelligibility with one another? But ultimately that will be discussed at length in part 2 of Belonging Again. But ultimately the point is, when we talk about the meaning crisis, we must be by that discussing creating the conditions in which people can be Nietzschean children and create their own capital X, which would be children of absolute knowing, to combine Hegel and Nietzsche. That is what we must be getting at with meaning-making practices. And ultimately, if meaning-making practices are to do just that, they're very good. And a lot of the stuff that Dr. Viveki could indeed prepare people and prime people to be able to engage in that kind of work to become Nietzschean children. But it is critical to understand that if by finding meaning, dealing with the meaning crisis, we are not talking about something that would help us develop into being a child, then this is not going to address the meaning crisis. Because for whatever meaning we have, it will only last until we realize we don't have a community, that we can't relate to other people, that we do not belong. And then the meaning that we thought we had will simply feel like it was a distraction from the truth, which is we have no belonging. And so, if we want to belong again, we will need to do the work to become children. Not childish, but children as Nietzsche describes, and that is going to take a lot of courage. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. For the playlist of Belonging Again, please visit YouTube. And for the list of the sections, please go to Medium. And thank you so much for your time.